When I first received my autism diagnosis, I had to answer what seemed to me like a very basic question. What do I call myself? Do I call myself a person with autism? Am I an autistic person? Should I refer to myself as someone on the spectrum? Do I associate myself with disability? And if so, am I a disabled person or am I a person with a disability? Questions about naming might feel very trivial, but the words that we use to describe ourselves really matter. And I also know that many people have many different beliefs, ideas, and thoughts about how we should refer to ourselves, especially when we're dealing with disability or neurodivergence or autism. I knew that a lot of folks used and preferred person-first language, and that is when we put person before the identity. So think person of color, or person with disability, or a person with autism, or a person on the spectrum. The person is the emphasis in that construction and that way of talking about who we are. But I also knew that a lot of people use identity-first language, and that's when you put the identity before the person. So think gay man, black person, female teacher. All of those have the identity first as an adjective before the noun. So if I followed that view, I would be an autistic person. Or if I associated with disability, I would be a disabled person. So what should I pick? What should I use? Why should I use it? Well, like every good academic, I decided I needed to do some research, and so I began reading articles and books on the topic, and then of course started getting stressed and anxious as I wasn't really finding the answers that I wanted. And when that happened, I went back to the books, reread articles, and again felt that sense of anxiety. I realized I probably would never have a definitive answer, but I learned some things along the way that I wanted to share with you. First, I learned a lot about the why people use different forms of language, why people use identity-first language, why people use person-first language. So those that argue for person-first language, it seemed to me, that generally wanted us to focus on the whole individual. So they would say things like, yes, this person has a disability, but they are more than that. And so they wanted to encapsulate the more than that essence by using person-first. People who use person-first language often argue that people are more than their diagnosis, so we should use language that encapsulates that. And so, in their view, identity-first language is stigmatizing because it emphasizes and only focuses on the disability as opposed to the whole person. But those who argue for identity-first language often disagree with that assessment. For many communities, such as the autistic community or the deaf community, using identity-first language is a source of pride, and it helps build a sense of community and connection with others. Identity-first language also emphasizes that the identity, the diagnosis, the disability is a part of the person, and it is an inseparable part of the person, and it often shapes how they view the world or interact in the world. And because your identity and your disability or your diagnosis really shapes how you view the world, it is a critical part of who you are that you want to emphasize, thus identity-first language. Here, learning a little bit more about the social model of disability can really help you understand why people advocate for identity-first language. And so I'm going to put a video in the description below that I created to explain what the social model of disability is. Basically, that model of disability focuses on society and how society is structured, and argues that the way society is structured is what is doing the harm and what is disabling people rather than people's own bodies or diagnoses. Still, I found others base their language use decisions on kind of a complex and dynamic process of assessing the advantages and disadvantages to each term. A great example of this is Margaret Price in her book Mad at School. In that book, Price has a section in her introduction where she just goes through all of the different words that people may have used or could use, or that she could use to describe herself, and assesses the benefits and downsides to each of them. So I encourage you to check out her book for more information about the importance of naming and language use. I'll provide a link to the book Mad at School in the description below. And that is a quick overview of the competing perspectives that I found when talking about language use as it relates to disability, autism, and neurodivergence. And as I was reading these various positions and the arguments for and against each, I came away with a few takeaways. First, I learned and was reminded that language is always evolving. Language is a slippery thing. Words are not stagnant in their meaning. Meanings change, evolve over time. Think of person-first and identity-first language when it comes to other areas of our identity. For example, usually we use gay man, not man with gayness. Usually we use black woman, not woman with blackness. But we also use people of color and not the identity-first language in that context. And so things change, things are slippery, they're not always determined. What society and what people with particular identities view as acceptable changes over time as we discuss the terms, as we debate the terms, as people reclaim certain terms. And so I learned to think of language use as not being about a set of rules that I needed to learn, but rather an ongoing and dynamic process, and that I needed to be attuned to the conversations that were happening about that language use. Second, because language is constantly changing and evolving, I realize there probably is never going to be the correct answer for what I should call myself, or the non-controversial answer for what I should call myself. I wanted to find that non-controversial answer. I wanted to find something that I could say about myself that everybody would accept, and there'd be no pushback on it. But I realized that simply was not going to be the case. There's always going to be people who advocate for one or the other, or there's going to be changes in how people view the language, so I was not going to find that one correct answer. Instead, I had to navigate those pluses and minuses about the language use for myself and decide what I was comfortable with and what I wanted to refer to myself and what I was comfortable explaining to other people. And so I learned and wanted to affirm other people's ability to self-determine what they wanted to be called and how they wanted to view their identity and share their identity with other people. And so if a gay man wants me to call him a man with gayness, I'm down with that. Likewise, I'm down if someone wants me to call them a person with disability or a disabled person, and I'm going to honor their choice and their decision and how they want to refer to themselves. So, where does that leave me at this time? Well, I really do like the language of on the spectrum. I really like how the spectrum language frames the conversation not just as a yes, no, you are autistic, but rather honors the wide variety of experiences that you might have or someone might have. For similar reasons, I also really like the phrase neurodivergent person or neurodivergence because it foregrounds a wide array of experiences that people could have, and it really is kind of that umbrella term to encapsulate a lot of different people who could all see themselves as a part of this broader neurodivergent community. And I do want to mention that I do struggle with person-first language a little bit. For me, person with autism kind of feels like I'm just kind of carrying around this heavy suitcase. There's something that is traveling with me as opposed to something that it is a part of who I am. And so I do prefer using that identity first language at this time. And I prefer to use identity first language because I want to be proud of who I am and I want to view it as a critical part of me and as something that shapes how I view the world, how I experience the world. And so that's where I'm at the moment. But because I've viewed this issue of language use as an ongoing process, I'm really open to involving my thoughts, continuing to assess the pros and cons to how we use language to describe disability, neurodivergence, autism, and so on. And so please join the conversation below. Let me know how you identify and the reasons why in the comments, and so we can continue this discussion about language use and how we refer to ourselves and how we see ourselves through the language that we use. And also, if you feel like you've learned something, please hit that like button to support the channel. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time.